The government has just published its schools white paper, which in part calls for all schools to be in multi-academy trusts by 2030. On the same day, it published what it says is its evidence, the case for a fully trust-led system. The Secretary of State says that he wants to be the evidence-led Secretary of State. So we want to look at the evidence that the DfE chooses to present to the world in this document. They've had months to prepare it, and we say they get 10 out of 10 for effort to try and produce evidence that supports them, but only 3 out of 10 for accuracy and 0 out of 10 for honesty. Now, the vast majority of the document has no evidence about the success of maths at all. It has evidence about the size of maths, the number of schools that are in maths. It has case studies about maths that are doing well, without any case studies of maths that aren't doing well. There are only 3 places in a whole 25-page document that says anything about evidence, and we're going to show you how all 3 of those claims are very misleading. On page 1, they have this line in bold. More than 7 out of 10 sponsored academies are now graded good or outstanding, compared to about 1 in 10 of the local authority maintained schools they replaced. Now that is true, but without much meaning. Almost all schools have improved their Ofsted gradings over the same time period. There is correlation here rather than causation. When the NEU carries out an analysis, like by like, then we see a very different pattern. If you think about schools that were previously rated less than good by Ofsted, but are now graded good or outstanding, so we're comparing like with like, schools that were rated less than good, maintained schools, that's local authorities, voluntary aided schools, 90% of the schools previously rated less than good are now good or outstanding. But if the school was in a sponsored-led academy, when it was rated less than good, at its second Ofsted, only 74% have improved. Or if you think about it the other way around, schools currently rated less than good, but previously good or outstanding, in maintained schools, 11% of them have got those worse gradings. But among sponsor-led academies, 28% have got worse. So the government's claim on this page, narrowly true, correlation, not causation. But when you look at the depth, it is absolutely not the correct picture to put forward. Being in a MAT does not make it more likely that your school will do well. The next place in the document where any evidence is provided is on pages 15 and 16, tables 5 and 6, where the DfE report the latest Ofsted rating for schools. They say on this chart that 15% of multi-academies trust schools are outstanding, 16% of local authority schools are outstanding. So much of a muchness, although local authority schools slightly in the lead. But the DfE fails to tell you that many of the good grades for schools in maths were in fact achieved when they were local authority schools. Since their first Ofsted inspection, some schools have changed their governance with joining a MAT. But clearly, if these tables are supposed to tell us about the benefits of different forms of school governance, they would have to report the governance of the schools when the inspection was carried out. To do anything else is plain misleading to the public and to politicians, and these pages are plain misleading. The third and last pages where they claim any evidence, page 17, where they have this strong statement, the best maths transform outcomes for pupils, particularly the most disadvantaged, and then they have 4 charts on page 18 that they say show that. But the NEU says, in our analysis, that their approach of showing the top 10% is highly selective and is statistically extremely flawed. And we will also show that the DfE has suppressed vital explanatory information, the number of children with pupil premiums. First of all, just think about the structure of the data they are providing and ask yourself why they've provided it in this way. They give us the bottom 10%, the bottom 25%, the 50th percentile, that's the average, the top 25% and the top 10%. The DfE is very keen to look at how the top 10% of maths do and compare that with the top 10% of local authorities. They claim the maths are ahead. The top 10% of maths are ahead by 79% to 73% for the top 10% of local authorities. They acknowledge that at the other end, that the worst performing 10% of maths do worse than the worst performing 10% of local authorities. And they just say, as if by magic, on page 19, that this will be sorted out by a single regulatory approach that will get all the poorly achieving maths to achieve as well as the best achieving maths. But they produce absolutely no evidence that this will work. And I think it's very unlikely to work. It's a bit like saying, here are the 10% fastest sprinters in the world. If we give everyone else the same regulatory regime, we can all run as fast as them. It brings us back. Why are they showing us the top 10% and the bottom 10% in the first place? Why have the DFE statisticians and the DFE politicians decided to show us that? Because that's what gives them the results they want. It's done because maths are much smaller than local authorities. So there's inevitably much more variation in their results. If you report the average height of 1,000 people, you'll get the average height of people in Britain. But if you report the average height of a group of 5 people, then you might get a much bigger figure or a much smaller figure, depending on whether you've got a particularly tall or a particularly small person in the group. So just because maths are smaller than local authorities, they have more variation. And that's a big reason why the top 10% here are doing better than the top 10% of local authorities. This is knowingly and misleadingly presented by the DFE. But actually, there is an even more damning error, if we're being charitable, the failure to report the pupil premium information for these schools. Now, this information isn't hard to come by. NEU statisticians, Andrew Baisley, got it very quickly. And the DFE has lots of statisticians who will have been combing this data. So they certainly do have this information. And it's really important. It has huge explanatory power. In the top 10% of maths that are supposed to be doing so much better than the top 10% of local authorities, in the maths, only 29% of children are eligible for pupil premium. But in the local authorities, that figure is 34%. Now, this has massive explanatory power, as we all know. And at some point in the process of preparing this document, the DFE has chosen to suppress this information. It also speaks back to their idea that they present in this document that regulation will improve the bottom 10% of maths to the same place as the top 10% of maths. The top 10% have 29% of children with pupil premium, but the bottom 10% have 47% of children with pupil premium. Regulation doesn't change that. Only huge investment in poverty reduction or massive investment in early years and smaller classes, etc., can do that. So we say the government's document is a con job, and you should not be conned. The DFE has not provided any real evidence that being in a mat helps schools succeed. The NEU has done its own analysis, which gives a whole other perspective. We have taken the Ofsted results for the last 2 Ofsteds of every school in the country. And we have looked at the schools that have been maintained schools at both inspections, the schools that have been in a MAT for both inspections, the schools that were maintained local authority or VA and then joined a MAT for the second inspection, and the schools that moved from one MAT to another, those that were rebrokered. And when you look at those 2 Ofsted results and break it down by those patterns of governance or changing governance, what do you find? Well, you find that maintained primary schools, local authority, voluntary aided, previously rated as outstanding, are much more likely to retain their outstanding gradings than at schools with other governance. 30% of outstanding local authority primary schools maintain their status. Only 7% of outstanding primary schools retain that status if they were in a MAT for the first and second Ofsteds. Shockingly, if a formerly outstanding primary school in a MAT is rebrokered, moved to another MAT, none of them retained their outstanding status. Look at it the other way round. Rebokered primary schools, schools that have got worse through the two Ofsteds. Rebrokered primary schools that had previously been rated as outstanding or good were much more likely to subsequently be rated as requires improvement or serious weaknesses. Only 12% of good or better local authority or voluntary aided primary schools fall to less than good at their next inspection. 35% of primary schools in MATs fall, and shockingly, 50% of formerly good or better primary schools, when in a MAT, will lose that status at their next inspection if they are rebrokered. This NEU analysis renders nonsensical the government's drive towards academisation in the name of standards. It demonstrates there's no compelling reason for a school to join a multi-academy trust. It provides strong evidence against the rebrokering of schools from one MAT to another. The government's latest call in this white paper to encourage or to force more schools into multi-academy trusts will not achieve what it sets out to do. Nadim Zahawi says he wants to be driven by evidence. He must respond to our evidence. He must pause this ideological drive. Teachers and parents want the government to focus their efforts on supporting schools to improve and on what works, and to drop their ideological obsession with marketisation and academisation. Thanks for listening. Please share this video message.